The morning sun poured through the blinds of the small Atlanta apartment, casting long golden stripes across the living room floor. Kofi Adebayo sat cross-legged on the couch, double-checking the contents of his backpack for the third time. His boarding pass was tucked into the front pocket, seat 14B, window side. His favorite book, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, was snug in the main compartment, its cover slightly bent from years of rereading. He'd packed a granola bar, a bottle of water, his headphones, and the little notebook where he scribbled down airplane facts his dad taught him. Everything was in place. His father, Captain Idris Adebayo, moved quickly around the kitchen, pouring coffee into a travel mug and zipping up his flight bag. He'd flown in from Chicago the night before and had just enough time to grab a few hours of sleep before heading back out. Today, though, he wasn't flying with Kofi. The 12-year-old was making the trip to Denver alone, to stay with his grandmother for a couple of weeks while his dad finished up a series of long-haul international routes. "You sure you don't want me to walk you to the gate?" Idris asked, glancing over his shoulder as he tied his shoes. Kofi shook his head. "Dad, I've done this before. I'm 12, not 2. Idris smiled, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Worry, maybe, or just the quiet ache of letting go a little more each time. "I know you're capable," he said, crouching down so they were eye to eye. "But the world doesn't always see you the way I do. Just keep your head up, okay? And if anything feels off, tell a crew member. Or text me. Doesn't matter if it's 3 a.m. my time." Kofi nodded. "I will." They took an Uber to the airport. The ride was quiet, filled only by the hum of traffic and the occasional burst of static from the driver's radio. Kofi watched the city blur past, the gas stations, the billboards, the rows of trees lining the highway, and tried to memorize the feeling of calm before the flight. Flying had always been special to him, not just because his dad was a pilot, but because up there above the clouds, everything felt orderly, clean, predictable. At the terminal, Idris walked him through security, even though Kofi insisted he didn't need to. He hugged his son tightly at the TSA checkpoint, ruffling his hair like he used to when Kofi was little. "You've got this," he said. "And remember, when you look out that window, you're seeing the same sky I see from the cockpit." Then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd heading toward the employee entrance. Kofi took a deep breath and made his way to the gate. The flight was a midday Horizon Skies Airlines service, modest, no frills, the kind of plane that carried business travelers, families, and the occasional solo kid like him. He found his seat early, stowed his backpack, and settled in by the window. The cabin smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. A woman with tired eyes sat in the aisle seat, already scrolling through her phone. Across the row, a man in a wrinkled suit dozed off before the doors even closed. Then she appeared. Lorna Vickers moved down the aisle with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done this job for years. Her uniform was crisp, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her smile practiced but thin. She checked boarding passes with quick, sharp movements, barely making eye contact. When she reached Kofi, she paused. "Seat 14B?" she asked, though she could clearly see the number on the overhead bin. Kofi nodded and held up his pass. She took it, glanced at it, then looked him up and down. His slightly oversized hoodie, his scuffed sneakers, the way he kept his hands folded in his lap like he was trying not to take up space. "This is an unaccompanied minor flight?" she asked, voice flat. "No," Kofi said. "I'm traveling alone, but I'm not a minor in the airline system. My dad arranged it all." Lorna's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Your dad arranged it?" "Yes, ma'am." She handed the pass back without another word and moved on. But Kofi felt it, the shift. The way her posture stiffened, the way she didn't offer the usual, "let me know if you need anything," that other attendants had given him on past trips. As the cabin filled, the atmosphere changed. The hum of conversation, the clatter of overhead bins, the occasional laugh, it should have felt normal. But Kofi couldn't shake the sense that he was being watched, not in a friendly way, more like he was a puzzle that didn't quite fit. When the safety demonstration began, Lorna stood at the front of the cabin, reciting the script with robotic precision. Her eyes swept over the passengers, but every time they passed Kofi, they lingered just a second too long. The plane taxied down the runway. Kofi pressed his forehead against the cool glass and watched the ground fall away. This was his favorite part. The moment when the wheels left the earth and everything below shrank into a patchwork of roads and rooftops. He always imagined his dad doing the same thing in the cockpit, just a few feet away, guiding them safely into the sky. But today, the magic felt distant. A few minutes into the flight, Lorna came by with drink orders. She asked the woman next to Kofi if she wanted coffee. She asked the man across the aisle if he preferred soda or water. When she got to Kofi, she didn't ask. She just said, "We don't serve drinks to kids without adult supervision unless it's part of the unaccompanied minor program." Kofi blinked. "I'm allowed to have water," he said carefully. "My dad confirmed it with customer service." Lorna gave a tight smile. "Policy's policy." She walked away. Kofi didn't say anything. He just pulled out his book and tried to focus on the words, but they blurred on the page. He wasn't thirsty, not really. But it wasn't about the water. It was about being seen, about being treated like he belonged. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly, white and soft. Inside, the cabin felt colder than it should. He thought about texting his dad. But what would he say? "The flight attendant was rude to me?" It sounded small, petty, and his dad had enough on his mind. Storms over the Midwest, fuel calculations, air traffic delays. Kofi didn't want to add to that, so he stayed quiet. He watched the wing flex gently in the wind, remembered his dad explaining how the flaps adjusted for altitude, how the engines hummed at just the right pitch to keep them steady. Those were the things that grounded him, the things that reminded him who he was, not just a black boy in a hoodie, but Kofi Adebayo, son of a man who commanded the sky with calm hands and a steady voice. Still, the unease clung to him like static. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, a few passengers got up to stretch. Kofi stayed put. He didn't want to draw attention. He didn't want to give anyone a reason to question him again. But then, as he shifted in his seat to get more comfortable, he caught Lorna watching him from the galley. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. He froze. It was just a small movement, adjusting his legs, tugging at his hoodie sleeve. But in that moment, it felt like a crime. Kofi looked down at his hands. They were clean. His clothes weren't flashy. He hadn't spoken out of turn. He'd followed every rule, so why did he feel like he was doing something wrong? The truth settled over him slowly like fog. It wasn't about what he did. It was about how he looked, and that realization hurt more than any sharp word ever could. He closed his book. Outside, the sun glinted off the wing. The plane soared on, smooth and sure. Inside, Kofi sat very still, trying to remember his father's voice. His calm certainty, the way he always said, "You belong wherever you go." But for the first time in a long time, Kofi wasn't sure he believed it. About an hour into the flight, the sky changed. What had been a smooth blue expanse turned choppy and gray, like someone had stirred the clouds with a giant spoon. The plane began to shudder gently at first, then more sharply. A rhythmic bumping that made coffee cups rattle in their trays and passengers grip their armrests tighter. A baby 2 rows back started to cry, its wails cutting through the low hum of the engines. Kofi didn't flinch. Turbulence was normal. His dad had explained it 100 times. It's just air moving around like rivers in the sky. The plane's built to handle it. So while others tensed, Kofi stayed calm. He even leaned a little closer to the window, watching how the wing flexed slightly with each jolt, bending but never breaking. It was fascinating, really. But calmness, it turned out, could be misunderstood. Lorna came down the aisle again, her heels clicking against the floor with sharp precision. Her eyes scanned the cabin like a hawk looking for prey. When they landed on Kofi, she stopped. "You," she said, voice low but edged with something sharp. "Stop moving around so much." Kofi blinked. "I'm not moving." "You're shifting, glancing, it's making people nervous." He looked around. The woman beside him was scrolling through her phone, unfazed. The man across the aisle had his eyes closed, earbuds in. No one was looking at him. No one seemed nervous at all, except maybe Lorna herself. "I was just watching the wing," Kofi said carefully. "My dad taught me to check how it moves during turbulence." I don't care what your dad taught you," she cut in, stepping closer. "You need to sit still, keep your hands where I can see them, and stop looking around like you're planning something." The words hit like a slap. Kofi's stomach dropped. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd barely spoken since takeoff. But now, in her eyes, he wasn't just a kid on a plane. He was a threat. A problem. Something to be managed. He swallowed hard and nodded, pulling his hands into his lap. Okay. Lorna gave a curt nod and walked away, but the damage was done. The calm he'd held on to since Atlanta was gone, replaced by a hot coil of shame he couldn't explain. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't argued. He just existed, and that apparently was enough to be seen as suspicious. A few seats behind him, Mateo Ruiz watched the whole exchange. He was new to Horizon Skies, only 3 months on the job and still learning how things worked. He'd seen Lorna handle difficult passengers before, but this felt different. There was no reason for her tone, no justification for the way she'd singled Kofi out. Mateo wanted to say something, to step in, but his throat tightened with fear. He was still on probation. One wrong move, one complaint, and he could lose his job. So he stayed quiet, pretending to organize snack packs in the galley, though his hands trembled slightly. Back in seat 14B, Kofi tried to disappear. He pulled his hoodie strings loose, then tightened them again. He stared at his shoes. He wished more than anything that his dad was in the cockpit right now, not just flying the plane, but close enough to see what was happening. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his father. "Everything okay up there?" Kofi hesitated. He wanted to tell the truth. "But how do you explain that you're being treated like a criminal, just for sitting quietly in your seat?" It sounded ridiculous, even in his own head. So he typed back, "Yeah, just some bumps. All good." He hit send, then immediately regretted it, because it wasn't all good. Not even close. As the turbulence eased, the cabin lights brightened slightly. Lorna returned with the meal carts, rolling them down the aisle with practiced ease. She handed out trays with plastic-wrapped sandwiches, tiny bags of pretzels, and juice boxes. When she reached Kofi's row, she paused. The woman next to him got her tray without a word. The man across the aisle even got a polite, "Enjoy your meal." But when Lorna got to Kofi, she held the tray just out of reach. "Hoodie off," she said. Kofi looked up, confused. "What? Company policy. No hoods during meal service. Could be a safety issue." Kofi frowned. "I've flown with Horizon Skies 6 times. No one's ever said that before." "Well, I'm saying it now," she replied, voice flat. "Take it off or no meal." He glanced around. A teenager 3 rows up wore a hoodie, eating a sandwich with the hood up. An older man near the back had a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. No one else was being asked to change how they dressed. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. Kofi's cheeks burned. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to give her more reason to watch him. So slowly he pulled the hoodie over his head, folding it neatly on his lap like it was something shameful. Only then did she hand him the tray. But she didn't stop there. As she turned to leave, she added, just loud enough for him and only him to hear, "Some kids need to learn how to act right on a plane. Not everyone gets special treatment just because they say their dad's important." The word stung worse than a shout. Kofi stared at his sandwich, the plastic wrap suddenly feeling like a barrier between him and everything normal. He wasn't hungry anymore. Mateo saw it all from the galley. This time he couldn't stay silent, not completely. When Lorna walked past, he muttered, "That wasn't necessary." She shot him a look that could freeze water. "Mind your business, Ruiz. You're still learning how this works." He looked down, said nothing, but later, when Lorna was busy in the front, Mateo quietly walked back down the aisle. He knelt beside Kofi's seat, pretending to check the seatbelt sign. "Hey," he whispered, slipping a sealed snack pack into Kofi's hand. "Extra granola bar. Pilot snack. Don't tell anyone." Kofi looked up surprised. Mateo gave him the smallest nod, just enough to say, "I see you," before moving on. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time since the flight began, Kofi didn't feel entirely alone. Still, the weight of the afternoon pressed down on him. He thought about his grandmother's house in Denver, the warm kitchen, the smell of ginger and cinnamon, the way she always had his favorite mango juice waiting in the fridge. He imagined walking through her door, dropping his backpack, and finally breathing easy. But first he had to survive the rest of this flight. Then came the moment that broke him. He needed to use the restroom. It wasn't urgent, but the long flight and the bottle of water he'd brought made it necessary. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up politely. Lorna was at the front restocking cups. She turned the second he moved. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, voice sharp. "To the bathroom," Kofi said, keeping his tone neutral. "The lavatory's closed until after beverage service." Kofi glanced at the sign above the restroom door. It glowed green. Available. "It's open," he said. "Not for you," she replied, stepping into the aisle to block his path. "Sit down." The command was so cold, so final that Kofi froze. He wasn't a toddler. He wasn't causing trouble. He just needed to use the restroom like any other passenger. An elderly woman in 13A, Evelyn Cho, with silver hair and kind eyes, spoke up softly. "He's just a boy. Let him go." Lorna turned, her expression hardening. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I'm in charge of cabin safety." "Not you," Evelyn didn't back down. "Safety doesn't mean treating children like suspects." A few passengers murmured in agreement. Someone farther back said, "Yeah, come on." But Lorna stood her ground. "Seat, now." Kofi's throat tightened. He didn't want to cry, not here. Not in front of everyone. But the injustice of it, the sheer unfairness, pressed against his ribs like a stone. He walked back to his seat, sat down and buckled his seatbelt with trembling fingers. Then, quietly, he pulled out his phone. This time, he didn't type a text. He recorded a voice note. His voice was quiet but steady, just like his dad had taught him to be in tough moments. "Dad, they're treating me like I did something wrong." He hit send. In the cockpit, Captain Idris Adebayo was monitoring radar for a developing storm system over Kansas. The co-pilot handled the radio chatter while Idris adjusted their altitude for smoother air. It was routine. Calm. Then his phone buzzed in the side pocket of his flight bag. He glanced at it. Saw it was from Kofi. He tapped the voice note. And when he heard his son's voice, so controlled, yet so clearly hurt, something inside him shifted. He looked at his co-pilot. "My boy's on this flight," he said, voice low but firm. "And something's off." Outside, the clouds thickened. Inside the cabin, Kofi stared out the window, gripping Mateo's granola bar like a lifeline. He didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time, he allowed himself to hope that someone, his father maybe, or even a stranger with kind eyes, would finally see him for who he really was. Not a problem. Not a threat. Just a boy who loved the sky, trusted his dad, and deserved to be treated with basic respect. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The voice note hung in the cockpit like a quiet storm. Captain Idris Adebayo didn't play it again. He didn't need to. He knew his son's voice better than his own heartbeat. And beneath Kofi's calm tone, Idris heard the tremor. The unspoken plea, "Something's wrong, and I don't know how to fix it." He glanced at his co-pilot, a quiet man named Dale who'd flown with him for years. "My boy's on this flight," Idris said again, this time with more weight. "Seat 14B. And from the sound of it, he's not being treated right." Dale nodded slowly. "You want me to take over?" "For a minute," Idris said. He unclipped his headset, stood, and smoothed his uniform. His movements were calm, but inside a slow fire burned, not rage, not yet. But the kind of focused anger that comes when someone you love is made to feel small for no reason at all. Back in the cabin, Kofi sat with his eyes fixed on the clouds, trying to steady his breathing. He'd replayed the last hour in his head over and over, searching for what he'd done wrong. Had he spoken too loudly? Sat too still? Looked too curious? Nothing made sense except the awful truth that maybe none of it was about what he did. Maybe it was just about who he was. He thought about the granola bar Mateo had given him. He hadn't opened it yet. It sat in his lap like a promise that not everyone saw him the way Lorna did. Then the intercom crackled to life. "Lorna, please report to the flight deck," came Idris's voice, calm, professional, but carrying an edge that made several passengers glance toward the front. Lorna, who'd been refilling coffee in the galley, froze. Her cup clattered against the counter. She straightened her jacket, smoothed her hair, and walked toward the cockpit with measured steps, her usual confidence masking the flicker of unease in her eyes. The moment she stepped inside and saw Captain Adebayo standing there, not in his seat, not behind the controls, but facing her like a man who'd just crossed a line he never thought he'd have to, her breath hitched. "Sir?" she said, forcing a polite tone. "Is everything all right?" Idris didn't return the pleasantries. "Do you know who that boy is?" he asked, voice low but steady. Lorna blinked. The passenger in 14B? Just a solo traveler as far as I know. He's my son, Idris said. The words landed like a stone in still water. Lorna's face went pale. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. I didn't realize. No, Idris said gently but firmly. You didn't, because you never asked. You never looked at his boarding pass closely. You never treated him like a person, just a problem to manage. Lorna's hands twisted together. Captain, I was only following protocol. There's been an increase in unruly minors and unruly. Idris cut in, his voice rising just enough to show the steel beneath. My son sat quietly. He asked for water. He wanted to use the restroom. He watched the wing during turbulence, the same wing I'm flying right now. That's not unruly. That's curiosity. That's respect for the machine that's keeping us all safe. He took a step closer. Instead of seeing a bright kid who knows more about this aircraft than half the passengers, you saw a threat. Why? Lorna looked down. I thought he seemed nervous, fidgety. Or maybe, Idris said quietly, you saw a black boy in a hoodie and assumed the worst. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Dale kept his eyes on the instruments, giving them space, but his jaw was tight. He'd seen this before. Not always this blatant, but close enough. Lorna finally whispered. I didn't mean. It doesn't matter what you meant. Idris interrupted. It matters what you did. You made my son feel unwelcome on a plane I'm flying. You made him doubt himself, and you did it in front of people who noticed. He paused, then added, when we land, I'll be filing a formal report, not just about you, but about a system that lets this happen without consequence. Lorna nodded, eyes glistening, but not with tears of remorse, more like fear of what came next. She mumbled an apology and stepped out of the cockpit. Her usual composure shattered. Back in the cabin, the change was immediate. Mateo, who'd been hovering near the rear galley, saw Lorna return with a dazed look. He watched as she avoided eye contact with everyone, especially seat 14B. Then, slowly, the other flight attendants began to shift. One of them, a woman named Priya with warm brown eyes, walked down the aisle and stopped by Kofi's seat. Hey, she said softly. I'm sorry about earlier. Can I get you anything? Water? Juice? A proper meal? Kofi looked up, surprised. I'm okay. You sure? She asked, genuine concern in her voice. He nodded, but this time it felt real. A few minutes later, Evelyn Cho, the woman from 13A, leaned over and patted his hand. You held your head high, young man, she said. That takes real courage. Kofi managed a small smile. Thanks. Even the woman in the aisle seat, who'd barely spoken since boarding, turned to him and said, I've got extra crackers if you're hungry. It wasn't grand. It wasn't dramatic. But it was human. And for the first time since takeoff, Kofi felt like he belonged. Meanwhile, Lorna stayed in the front galley, arms crossed, staring at the floor. She didn't serve anyone else. She didn't make announcements. She just stood there, wrapped in the consequences of her own assumptions. Mateo finally gathered his courage and approached her. You okay? He asked, though he already knew the answer. She didn't look at him. I didn't know he was his son. That's not the point, Mateo said quietly. Would it have mattered if he wasn't? Lorna didn't answer. Up in the cockpit, Idris retook his seat. His hands rested lightly on the controls, but his mind was still with his son. He keyed the intercom again, not to call anyone this time, but to speak to the whole cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Adebayo. We're now cruising at 35,000 feet, with smooth skies ahead all the way to Denver. Estimated arrival is on time. I want to thank you for your patience and your kindness. He paused, then added, flying is more than metal and fuel. It's trust. And today I'm reminded how important it is to treat every passenger with that trust, especially the quiet ones. A few passengers exchanged knowing glances. Some even smiled. Kofi heard his father's voice and felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't cry, but he did sit a little taller. The rest of the flight passed in a different rhythm. The tension that had coiled through the cabin like a wire slowly unwound. People chatted. A child laughed. Someone shared earbuds with their seatmate to watch a movie. Kofi finally opened the granola bar Mateo had given him. It tasted like oats and honey and something else. Relief, maybe. He pulled out his notebook and began to write. Not facts about planes this time, but something new. Today I learned that standing still can be an act of courage, that kindness can come from strangers, and that my dad sees me, even when I feel invisible. As the plane began its gradual descent toward Denver, the sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden rays across the cabin. Kofi pressed his forehead to the window again, watching the patchwork of land grow clearer. Rivers, highways, neighborhoods, all coming into focus. Soon, he'd be on the ground. Soon, his grandmother would be waiting with open arms and mango juice in the fridge. But more than that, he'd made it through. Not unscathed. Not unchanged. But whole. And somewhere ahead in the cockpit, his father guided them home, not just with skill, but with love. The wheels touched down with a soft thud. The cabin lights brightened. Passengers began gathering their things, stretching, blinking in the daylight that poured through the windows. Kofi zipped up his backpack, tucked his notebook inside, and stood. This time, no one told him to sit down. This time, no one watched him like he didn't belong. He walked down the aisle with his head up, past Lorna, who couldn't meet his eyes, and past Mateo, who gave him a small, proud nod. And when he stepped off the jet bridge into the bright Denver terminal, he didn't look back, because he knew one thing for sure. He'd never forget this flight. But he also knew he'd fly again. And next time, he'd do it with even more quiet strength. The moment the cabin door opened, a hush fell over the jet bridge, not the kind of silence that comes from emptiness, but the quiet that follows something important. Passengers filed out slowly, some glancing back at Kofi as they passed, their expressions soft with something between sympathy and admiration. No one said anything out loud, but their eyes spoke clearly. "We saw what happened, and you handled it well." Kofi kept his gaze forward, shoulders squared, backpack snug against his spine. He didn't look for Lorna, he didn't need to. Her presence had already shrunk, folded into the corners of the aircraft like a shadow retreating from light. At the end of the jet bridge, standing just inside the terminal with his arms crossed and his pilot's cap tucked under one arm, was Captain Idris Adebayo. He hadn't gone straight to crew debriefing. He hadn't handed off his flight bag to ground staff. He'd waited. For his son. When Kofi saw him, the tight knot in his chest finally loosened. He didn't run. He wasn't that kind of kid. But his steps quickened just enough to show how much he needed this. Idris didn't say a word at first. He just opened his arms. Kofi walked right into them. For a long moment, father and son stood there in the middle of the bustling airport corridor, surrounded by rolling suitcases and hurried travelers, yet completely still in their own quiet world. Idris held him like he was something precious because he was. Not because he was his son, but because he'd faced something unfair and hadn't let it break him. "You okay?" Idris finally asked, voice low. Kofi nodded against his shoulder. "Yeah, now I am." Idris pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. "You didn't do anything wrong up there." "I know," Kofi said. And for the first time, he really did. A few feet away, passengers who'd been on the flight began to clap, softly at first, then with more warmth. It wasn't loud or showy, just a ripple of quiet respect like rain on a roof. An elderly man gave a thumbs up. Evelyn Cho, still clutching her carry-on, smiled through tears. Even the woman who'd offered crackers earlier gave a small wave. Kofi ducked his head, embarrassed, but Idris gently turned him to face them. "Let them see you," he murmured. "You earned this." So Kofi stood tall and gave a small, humble nod. No grand gesture, just acknowledgement. And in that moment, he wasn't just a boy who'd been mistreated. He was someone who'd carried himself with dignity when it would have been easier to crumble. Back on the plane, the crew began their post-flight routine. Lorna moved mechanically, collecting trash, checking seat pockets, avoiding the eyes of her co-workers. Mateo watched her from across the cabin. He wanted to feel angry, but mostly he felt sad for her, for Kofi, for the way things had gone. Priya, the flight attendant who'd brought Kofi water, walked up to Lorna and said quietly, "You're going to have to talk to HR about this." Lorna didn't argue. She just nodded, her usual sharpness gone, replaced by something hollow. Meanwhile, Idris and Kofi made their way through the terminal toward baggage claim. They didn't rush. They walked side by side, shoulders almost touching, the kind of closeness that didn't need words. "Did you really file a report?" Kofi asked after a while. "I'm going to," Idris said, "but not just to punish her. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to another kid." Kofi thought about that.
"Do you think she'll get fired?"
"I don't know," Idris admitted. "And honestly, that's not my call. But consequences aren't just about losing a job. Sometimes the hardest thing is looking in the mirror and knowing you failed someone who trusted you." Kofi was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mateo was nice. He gave me a snack when she wouldn't." Idris smiled. "Good people exist everywhere, even in tough places. Remember that." They reached the baggage carousel just as Kofi's grandmother, Nana Adwoa, came into view. She wore a bright yellow head wrap and a denim jacket covered in pins from her travels. Her eyes lit up the second she saw them. "Kofi," she cried, rushing forward. She wrapped him in a hug that smelled like cloves and lavender. "My boy, you look tired." "I'm okay, Nana," he said, but he leaned into her anyway. She pulled back and studied his face. Then she looked at Idris. "What happened?" Idris didn't sugarcoat it. He told her everything, calmly, clearly, without anger, but without softening the truth either. Nana Adwoa listened, her expression shifting from concern to sorrow to quiet resolve. When he finished, she turned to Kofi and cupped his face in her hands. "You are not what they think you are," she said firmly. "You are smart. You are kind. And you belong everywhere you go, especially in the sky." Kofi nodded. He believed her. Later that evening, after a warm meal of jollof rice and fried plantains, after Kofi had showered and changed into soft pajamas, he sat on the porch with his dad. The Denver air was cool, scented with pine and distant rain. Fireflies blinked in the garden. "Are you going to tell the airline what really happened?" Kofi asked. "I already started," Idris said. "I spoke with the chief pilot and the head of in-flight services before I left the airport. They took it seriously. Will they believe you?" "They saw the passenger feedback," Idris said. "Several people wrote notes before they left the plane. Evelyn Cho even gave her contact info. And Mateo? Well, he's willing to speak up too." Kofi was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't want her to lose her job just because of me." Idris looked at him surprised. "Why not?" "Because if she loses it, she might just get angry. But if she learns something, maybe she'll treat the next kid better." Idris smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "That's a lot of grace for someone who hurt you." "I didn't learn it from you for nothing," Kofi said softly. Inside the house, Nana Adwoa watched them through the window, her heart full. She'd raised Idris to be strong but fair, and now she saw that same spirit in her grandson. The next morning, Horizon Skies Airlines launched an internal review. Captain Adebayo didn't demand punishment. Instead, he asked for change. He proposed a new training module, co-developed with community leaders and psychologists, focused on unconscious bias, cultural awareness, and de-escalation techniques for flight crews. He also suggested an anonymous feedback system, where passengers could rate crew conduct without fear of retaliation. The airline agreed. Not because they had to, but because Idris had spent 20 years earning their trust, not just as a pilot, but as a man of integrity. Lorna was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. She met with HR, then with a diversity officer. She didn't deny what happened. Instead, she admitted she'd acted on instinct, on assumptions she didn't even realize she carried. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a start. Mateo, meanwhile, was called in for a different reason. The airline thanked him for his courage. They fast-tracked his probation review and invited him to help design the new training program. For the first time, he felt like his voice mattered. Back in Denver, Kofi settled into his grandmother's house like a stone sinking into warm water. He helped her in the garden, read books on the porch swing, and called his dad every night, even when Idris was halfway across the world. But something had shifted in him. He wasn't just the quiet boy who loved airplanes anymore. He was someone who'd faced unfairness and chosen kindness anyway. Someone who understood that standing up didn't always mean shouting. It could mean staying calm, staying true and trusting that goodness would find its way. One afternoon, while browsing the local library, he stumbled upon a flyer for a youth aviation mentorship program at the nearby airport. It was for kids ages 10 to 16, offering flight simulators, cockpit tours, and talks with real pilots. He stared at it for a long time. Then he took out his notebook and wrote, "Maybe I can help other kids feel like they belong up there too." He signed up the next day. When his dad heard, he didn't just say he was proud. He asked if he could volunteer as a guest speaker. Kofi grinned. "Only if you promise not to embarrass me." "I make no promises," Idris laughed. "But I'll try." The incident never made the news. There were no viral videos, no angry headlines. But within Horizon skies, it became a quiet turning point. A story told in training rooms and crew briefings as an example of what not to do and what to do instead. And for Kofi, it became part of his story. Not the whole thing, just a chapter. One that taught him that dignity isn't given. It's carried. And no one can take it from you unless you let them. As the weeks passed, he found himself looking up at the sky more often. Not just to watch planes, but to remember. He belonged there too. Not because of his father's title, but because of his own heart. And that was enough. Weeks passed, and the sharp edges of that flight began to soften. Not because it was forgotten, but because something new grew around it. Kofi settled into his grandmother's Denver home like a seed finding good soil. Mornings started with the smell of ginger tea and the sound of Nana Adwoa humming old Ghanaian lullabies while watering her garden. Evenings were for homework, chess games on the porch, and long phone calls with his dad, whose voice always carried the quiet hum of an airport in the background. Announcements, rolling suitcases, the distant roar of an engine powering up for takeoff. But Kofi wasn't just waiting for his dad to finish his rotation. He was building something. The Youth Aviation Mentorship Program met every Saturday at Centennial Airport, a small but busy airfield on the edge of the city. The first time Kofi walked in, he kept his hands in his pockets and his eyes down, half expecting someone to question why he was there. But the coordinator, a retired air traffic controller named Mr. Ellis with a bushy mustache and a laugh like a foghorn, took one look at him and said, "You're Idris Adebayo's boy, aren't you? You've got his eyes. Welcome." No suspicion, no hesitation. Just welcome. That day, Kofi sat in a flight simulator for the first time, not as a passenger, but as a pretend pilot. His hands trembled slightly on the yoke, but when the instructor said, "You've got this," something clicked. He remembered his dad's voice. Flying isn't about strength. It's about listening, to the plane, to the sky, to yourself. He listened. By the third session, he was helping younger kids adjust their headsets and explaining how altimeters worked. He didn't do it to impress anyone. He did it because he remembered how it felt to be the only one who didn't seem to belong, and he didn't want anyone else to feel that way. One Saturday, a new kid showed up, 10 years old, wearing a too-big jacket and clutching a crumpled permission slip. He hovered near the door, eyes darting around like he was ready to bolt. Kofi recognized that look instantly. He walked over. "First time?" he asked gently. The boy nodded. "I was nervous too," Kofi said. "But the simulators are way cooler than they look. Want to try one together?" The boy hesitated, then nodded again. They spent the morning flying a virtual Cessna over the Rockies, laughing when they accidentally nosedived into a cloud. By the end, the boy was grinning. "You're really good at this," he said. Kofi shrugged. "I just pay attention." But inside, he felt something shift. He wasn't just healing from what happened on that flight. He was turning it into something useful. Something kind. Back at Horizon Skies, changes were unfolding too. Captain Adebayo's proposal had been approved, and the new bias awareness training rolled out to all cabin crews. It wasn't a 1-hour lecture with a quiz at the end. It was real work, role-playing scenarios, listening to passenger stories, learning how assumptions can shape actions without anyone even realizing it. Lorna returned to duty after a month's leave, not as the same person who'd blocked Kofi from the restroom, but as someone trying, however imperfectly, to do better. She volunteered for the first training cohort. During a group discussion, she spoke quietly about her own upbringing, about the messages she'd absorbed without questioning, about how fear had disguised itself as caution. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just said, "I didn't see him, and I should have." Mateo, now a full-fledged crew member, led one of the breakout sessions. He shared how he'd stayed silent that day, not out of malice, but out of fear, and how that silence had weighed on him more than any reprimand ever could. Doing nothing, he told the group, is still a choice. The airline also launched the anonymous feedback system Kofi's dad had suggested. Within the first month, dozens of notes came in, some praising crew members for small acts of kindness, others flagging moments of discomfort. Management reviewed everyone. None of it was perfect. Change never is. But it was movement. And movement in the right direction is everything. One evening, Kofi sat on the porch with his notebook open, sketching the layout of a cockpit from memory. Nana Adwoa brought him a glass of mango juice and sat beside him. "You've been quiet today," she said. "Just thinking," he replied. "About flying?" "About people," he said. "How someone can look at the same kid and see two completely different things. One person sees trouble. Another sees potential, same boy, different eyes." Nana Adwoa sipped her tea. "That's why we choose our eyes carefully," she said. "Not everyone will see you clearly, but you don't have to shrink yourself to fit their blurry vision." Kofi smiled. "Dad said something like that once. He learned it from me," she said with a wink. A few days later, Captain Adebayo landed in Denver for a short layover. He didn't have much time, just enough for dinner and a walk, but he made it count. They went to a small Ethiopian restaurant Kofi had discovered, where the injera was soft and the dorawat spicy enough to make your eyes water. Over dinner, Idris asked, "Do you ever think about that flight now?" "Sometimes," Kofi admitted, "but not like before. It doesn't hurt as much." "Good," Idris said, "because you shouldn't carry that weight forever." "I don't," Kofi said. "I carry the lesson." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the street outside, people walking dogs, kids riding bikes, the golden light of late afternoon spilling over the rooftops. Then Kofi asked, "Do you think I could really be a pilot someday?" Idris didn't laugh. He didn't say, "We'll see." He looked his son in the eye and said, "You already are. You just don't have the wings yet." Kofi grinned. "That's cheesy." "Maybe," Idris said, "but it's true." The next Saturday, Kofi stood in front of the mentorship group, not as a participant, but as a guest speaker. Mr. Ellis had asked him to share his story, and after thinking it over, Kofi agreed. Not to shame anyone, not to play the victim, but to show other kids that even when the world tries to make you feel small, you can still rise. He didn't mention Lorna by name. He didn't describe every harsh word. Instead, he talked about how it felt to look out the window and wonder if you belonged in the sky. How silence from others can feel like a wall, and how one small act of kindness from Mateo, from Evelyn, from his dad, can be enough to keep you going. When he finished, a girl in the back raised her hand. "Did you ever want to stop flying after that?" Kofi thought for a moment. "For a little while, yeah. But then I realized the sky didn't do anything wrong. The plane didn't do anything wrong. Flying is still beautiful. I just had to learn how to protect my love for it." The room was quiet. Then someone clapped. Then everyone did. Afterward, 3 kids came up to him. One asked how to start learning about navigation. Another wanted book recommendations. The third just said, "Thanks for telling us." That night, Kofi wrote in his notebook, "Today, I didn't just remember who I am. I helped someone else remember who they could be." Months later, Horizon Skies released a short internal video featuring crew members talking about respect, inclusion, and the quiet power of seeing passengers as people, not problems. Captain Adebayo appeared in it, standing in front of a parked aircraft, saying, "Every person who steps onto this plane brings a story. Our job isn't just to get them from point A to point B, it's to honor that story while they're in our care." The video was shown at every new hire orientation. Kofi never saw it, he wasn't part of the airline, but his dad sent him a still frame, a photo of the two of them at the Denver airport, right after the flight, standing side by side under the terminal lights. On the back, Idris had written, "This is what courage looks like." Kofi taped it to his bedroom wall. Years would pass. Kofi would graduate high school, earn his private pilot's license at 19, and eventually join a regional airline, not Horizon Skies, but one with similar values, one that valued not just skill but character. He'd wear his uniform with pride, not because of the title, but because of the promise it carried, to treat every passenger with the dignity he once had to fight for. And sometimes, when he taxied down the runway with a full cabin behind him, he'd glance at the wing and smile, remembering a 12-year-old, Boy who once watched the same metal bend in the wind and wondered if he'd ever be allowed to fly. He did, not just in the sky but in his heart, and that, more than anything, was the real destination.